Why don't we get settled? Hi there. For those of you I haven't met, my name is Dan Sullivan. I'm the research director here at the Chicago Fed, and it's definitely my pleasure to welcome everyone to this Neighborhood and Labor Market Symposium. Obviously, this is an extremely timely topic, given the state of the labor market and the economy in general with what's been going on. We have extremely high unemployment, and obviously in certain places it's even higher, much higher than the sort of 9% kind of figure that we have nationally. So I'm looking forward to hearing about various strategies, things we can do. Obviously, the Fed has its standard strategy, which is to sort of provide monetary accommodation. And we're doing that, doing our best in that regard. There are those who think that there's sort of big structural problems in the labor market, which I tend to think that somewhat there are. I don't think that means we shouldn't do all we can do on the monetary policy front. I've been pretty strong in believing that there is high value to having a very accommodative monetary policy given the current situation. But you can't deny that there are bigger, longer running problems that the labor markets, and especially in certain areas of the country, face. And so I think it's really important that we sort of get together occasionally and have these symposias and sort of learn more what can be done. Because even after we come out of the bad period of general economic activity that we have, we're going to face difficulties in many areas as well going forward. So we need to be thinking about what our strategies are, even as we continue to do the best we can on the sort of monetary policy front. So this is a topic or this general area of labor market adjustments and things that can be done. Try and help certain segments of the labor market. It's something that the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago had a periodic running interest in. A number of us here actually have interests in labor market economics, and so we've, when we're not thinking hard about monetary policy, have been very interested in what can be done, what kind of strategies that localities and the nation can do to sort of try and improve things. I'll just note we've had several seminars or symposia over the years, sort of big conferences where we try to bring together academic researchers, the frontline people, and also try and get some policy people in the room. We had one back in 2003 that was Understanding Isolation and Change in Urban Neighborhoods, where we definitely got into some of the issues about whether the problems when jobs aren't the same places where people live. Back in 2004, we had one that I worked quite hard on myself on job loss causes, consequences, and policy responses, where we thought a lot about what are the strategies that might work for helping people who've been displaced, lost a job they maybe held a long period of time and then now need to sort of do something different. Back in 2007, we had a big conference on strategies for improving the economic mobility of workers, meaning the economic mobility of workers, strategies that would maybe help people who've started from disadvantaged circumstances to sort of move forward. So I'm noting here that we actually haven't had a big conference like this in 4 years. We should probably be thinking about whether it's time to do another one of these things, because I think there's definitely lots to think about. And getting the experts from the sort of research community together with the policymakers is always a very helpful thing to do. I guess I also note that we have something going on right now. We're just getting started on called the Industrial Cities Initiative. And we're going to try and sort of look at what's worked and what hasn't worked in various cities in the Midwest and try and find best practices, because I think it is a promising area to try and understand what communities can do locally to sort of help out in these difficult labor market situations. As I said, I'm interested in labor market economics for a long period of time. And I wouldn't want to try and summarize what's known about all the things that people have come up with. But it definitely, there's lots of gaps in our knowledge in terms of what communities can do and what national policies should be to sort of try and help different groups of workers. And in my own mind, I think about categorizing them into the sort of the displaced workers, the people who've had a solid job for a long period of time, and because the shocks to the economy or something else, they become unemployed. I think we know quite a bit about what works for them, and at least for some of them, training seems to be an option, although it's not so great to necessarily train somebody who's close to retirement, so we have to sort of think about alternative options for others. on the sort of front of the disadvantaged workers, people who start out not having had one of those sort of good, solid labor market careers, I think there's a lot less known about what works. Seems like some things work for women, but don't work very well for young men, and I think we need to work hard to try and find out what the strategies are that can actually help more broadly. And I think this sort of idea of basing it on community and strategies that involve local areas getting together to work on things have at least a lot of promise. So I'm hoping we're going to be able to sort of talk about that. Anyway, that's all I have to say. I'm looking forward to a little bit of the discussion I can stay for. I have to go to another meeting fairly quickly, unfortunately. But staff's going to tell me all the good stuff, all the good ideas that come forward here, and I look forward to hearing more. Chris Walker is going to give us another welcome as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Dan. Hello, everyone. I am Chris Walker, Director of Research for Local Initiative Support Corporation, and I work out of Washington, D.C. And the image in front of you reminds me of all of those C-SPAN broadcasts where somebody is speaking at the lectern, but the Senate is empty. There will be a panel. I want to provide you with a little bit of background on today's discussions and for those that will come in our upcoming sessions. Local Initiative Support Corporation, or LISC, has long been associated with place-based approaches to addressing the challenges posed by, the challenges confronted by poor families. And over many years, we've done this through investments in urban real estate, primarily. But in the last 10 to 15 years, we've built out a national portfolio of programs that extend into workforce, community safety, community organizing, volunteerism, commercial district revitalization, and a number of other activities that are connected to real estate but are about something else. And this has made possible a fundamental kind of rethinking on our part as an institution about what we want to do in American neighborhoods and how we want to go about doing that. And so we've committed ourselves as an institution to comprehensive approaches to change. It's a little bit like everything works when everything works. Not doing housing alone, not doing job development alone, not doing education alone, but trying to do all of these in combination so that we get some payoff from the synergies among these a variety of activities. And by doing so, we can reinvigorate the terms of debate about community development and how we pursue it, and also more effectively connect to the broader policy issues and challenges that confront us, and that's what this seminar series is about. Our approach to comprehensive development we call building sustainable communities, not to be confused with HUD's Sustainable Communities Initiative. This is an approach to community change worked out initially in the South Bronx in the early 1990s, late 1980s, and perfected, though, at least in our view, perfected here in Chicago. And now, in the New Communities program that many of you are no doubt familiar with. But we've now adapted this approach for use in 15 to 20 other cities, depending on how you count them, upwards of 50 to 75 neighborhoods. And with the support of the MacArthur Foundation, we created a subsidiary, if you like, called the Institute for Comprehensive Community Development, intended to do two things. One, to harvest the wisdom and experience of those working in low-income communities following comprehensive approaches to change, and translate that experience and wisdom throughout our own organization, which has committed itself in the 27 urban areas where we work to pursuing this strategy. But we can't do that. It's not automatic. We can't do that without some very purposive and strategic support being offered from the national level, and that's what the Institute for Comprehensive Community Development is all about. And our second ambition then is through the Institute to build out the field of community development following comprehensive lines which will be appropriate and available to people working in low-income communities throughout the United States, whether we're working in those places or not. And so we have a broader audience in mind for the Institute. And it is under Institute sponsorship that we're partnering in the convening of this discussion series. Why are we doing this then? At the inaugural meeting of the board of the Institute for Comprehensive Community Development back in March of 2007, Julia Stash of the MacArthur Foundation issued a challenge to us, and basically she had expressed some annoyance with the fact that the conversations about regionalism and regional approaches to economic development and community change often take place without a neighborhood voice and vice versa. And that annoyance registers with us who work in low-income communities, in poor neighborhoods, where sometimes this regional discussion takes on a kind of an air of abstraction, as if regional policies are somehow disconnected with any real place, or places with their own market circumstances, community constituencies, and locus of responsibility for affecting community change. It puts me in the mind of Kissinger's famous line about Europe, and if you want to get Europe on the phone, who do you call? There is no one locus of responsibility. There's no organizing device for affecting change at the regional level. So regional policies have a locus, and they have a spatial locus, and in many instances, that spatial locus are places where community developers work. So, as I mentioned before, we're involved in place-based approaches to change, and once upon a time there was a talk about this distinction or difference between place-based approaches and people-based approaches, and whether or not one was better than the other in terms of dealing with the problems confronting low-income people. And you don't hear that much about that anymore because I think the parties to the debate exhausted themselves over what turned out to be something that was a rather sterile discussion. But also, it came to the realization that there were elements of people-based approaches in place-based initiatives and vice versa. And that's the kind of conception that we hope to advance in this series, that there are low-income community implications for the regional policies that we adopt, and what we do in low-income communities has spatial or has regional implications. So we want to think about then a discussion between the neighborhood focus and the regional focus as being essentially driven by three basic questions. One of them is, what are the patterns of activity within and across metropolitan areas in different kinds of markets? And what do these changes portend for the ability of low-income families and poor neighborhoods to get ahead? Secondly, for community developers wanting to advance the life prospects of low-income households in places where we work, what should we do to seize any opportunity created by effective regional action? And then lastly, for the mainstream systems of employment, affordable housing, economic development, programming, and policymaking, what accounts should be taken of the location and characteristics of the communities where their clientele reside? We've been pretty purposive about the form and content of this series. We wanted discussions that were focused, but not constrained. So we did not ask for formal presentations of papers. That would involve a panel of people reading off a PowerPoint slide for about an hour, leaving 15 minutes for questions, as often happens. Rather, we wanted to organize a session which was about the discussion and not the presentations. We also wanted a low-budget option, so we weren't going to spend money commissioning papers from renowned academics. Rather, we have begged, cajoled people like Mark to give us the benefit of his thinking, but without a formal paper as such. And then finally, we wanted to put together a discussion series that took explicit account of the fact that metropolitan areas are very different from one another. And as part of our plea for bringing concreteness into the regional discussion, we wanted discussions to take place in each region nearly simultaneously with the discussion that we have on a national panel. And part of our deliberate intent here is to explore the differences across very different kinds of metropolitan areas, the metropolitan areas represented in this discussion series, and who are joining us live from their respective sites. Boston, Pittsburgh, Twin Cities, Houston, and the Bay Area, in addition to Chicago. I want to say just a few more brief words about the material you have in front of you. You should have in your package a short paper from Mark Elliott, who will be speaking next. And then you'll have a short write-up of some statistics prepared by Urban Institute and by LISC researchers on intra-metropolitan and across metropolitan area distinctions in certain characteristics of the labor market. We supplied that really as a background rather than, again, as a formal presentation, so I'm not going to talk very much about what the contents are of that paper. But just make a few notes before I turn it over to Mark, or observations, I should say. It is a mixed record, what we see happening in labor markets based on information that we prepared for these tables. The so-called primary cities, what we used to call central cities, are gaining ground on their suburbs between 2000 and 2007, 2009 on average household income and labor force participation and some other measures of well-being. At the same time, we're seeing a loss of jobs at the lower earnings categories in central cities, which are outpacing those of the suburbs. And possibly related, we see that suburbs are the location of choice for both residents with jobs in construction, manufacturing, and retail trade, as well as the location of those jobs. Nevertheless, if we look at a rough indicator of job plenitude, job access, at least as defined by proximity, there are, in almost every sector, more jobs per resident in cities than there are in suburbs, suggesting that spatial mismatch, which we once used to think about primarily as a central city problem, may indeed be more of a suburban one instead. So the last point I'll make about the paper and the statistics that you have in front of you is that although there are a few common findings across metro areas, there are 6 metropolitan areas discussed in the paper, and there are 6 different stories to some extent, which is why we're having 6 different discussions today. I want to now turn this over to Mark Elliott. Mark is president of Mobility, which is a national nonprofit organization dedicated to identifying, evaluating, and expanding economic opportunities, economic mobility strategies for low-income people. Before launching Mobility, Mark was executive vice president of public-private ventures in Philadelphia, where he developed and managed several national employment initiatives. And before that, he was with the Ford Foundation in New York. So let me now turn it over to Mark.
Good morning, everyone. I'm here for a couple of reasons. I think first, just to get the conversation started, but I also believe Chris Walker saw this as an opportunity for me to be able to talk about some of the major mistakes I made early on in my career. But more on that in a few minutes. We're all aware that America is one of the most urbanized countries in the world. Over 80% of us live in an urban area. But unlike other developed countries, most of us live in suburbs rather than cities. Preparing the paper for today's conversation gave me the opportunity to review some of the most recent trends in research on this phenomenon. Here's just a quick summary of what I found. Employment continues to grow more in the suburbs than the central cities, with fastest growth on the periphery of metropolitan areas. Suburbanization of people has followed And today, a majority of whites, blacks, Hispanics, and Asians live in the suburbs as compared to the central cities. So every major racial ethnic group, the majority lives in the suburbs. Hispanics have accounted for fully half of suburban population growth and are now the largest racial ethnic group in 49 of our 100 largest metropolitan areas. Also in the decade, the number of poor people in suburbs outnumbered the number of poor people in cities by at least 1.5 million people. So given these trends, it's not surprising that the number of poor people living in suburbs is greatest in the metropolitan areas with the greatest job sprawl. As Chris pointed out just now, and when he saw my paper, that may mean that the most isolated low-income communities are in the suburbs rather than in the central cities. It's a really interesting phenomenon. And just as a way of helping me understand who's here, how many people here work on neighborhood employment issues? Hands in the air. Okay, keep your hand in the air if you focus on cities. Okay, everybody put their hands down. Now those who work on neighborhood employment issues in the suburbs, raise your hands. So we may be, in fact, quite far behind this trend of decentralization. We may be focusing more on the central cities, certainly disproportionately to the amount of poverty that there is in the suburbs. So regardless of what the major trends are nationally, and obviously that's only the simplest of overviews, it's crucial to understand not what's happening generally, but what's happening in your city and metropolitan area. It's likely, certainly, that Detroit and San Francisco are going to be very, very different. And as you're implementing program strategies, that has to be the crucial lens you look at. So we have continued metropolitan growth with employment, population, and even poverty all growing fastest in the suburbs. So we face a much more complex labor market than we did even 15, 20 years ago. It makes it much more challenging to find appropriate workforce development responses. The two most common approaches to the physical isolation of communities from employment are reverse commuting, bringing people to the jobs, and economic development, bringing jobs back to the people. I take a look at both in my background paper, but here I'm really going to focus on reverse commuting, which takes us back to the mistake I mentioned earlier. In the early 1990s, I was working at the Ford Foundation. That wasn't a mistake, specializing in employment strategies for the urban poor, and identified two approaches that I really thought were worth investing in. One was sectoral employment, believe it or not, basically completely unknown at the time. It's now become common parlance in workforce development. And reverse commuting, which responded to the physical isolation of the urban poor from suburban employment opportunities. Ford Grant supported Mark Hughes, who was then at Princeton University, to do the basic research, Urban Institute to publicize the research. We got Housing and Urban Development, MacArthur, Rockefeller involved, and we turned to PPV to launch a demonstration to test whether reverse commuting would actually be an effective way to deal with this employment challenge. PPV developed a random assignment demonstration. It was in 4 cities, Baltimore, Milwaukee, St. Louis, and Denver, and there was actually a scale site here in Chicago. Has anybody heard of Suburban Job Link? Yes. They operated the scale site here. Then after the Ford grant was made, and my friend Craig Howard can attest to this as a common path for Ford program officers, I went to PPV to launch their labor market program and soon took responsibility for Bridges to Work demonstration.
I never went to PPV though.
Yeah, well, you have your own path. We can talk about that later. In each location, the organization designated a poor urban neighborhood where they would recruit people from, and a suburban community which was rich with employers who were really looking for people to fill jobs. As the economy strengthened, the program sites had to put more, this was like late 1990s, 1997 that we really launched. The program sites had to put more effort and resources towards recruitment to bring people into the program. This may seem kind of surprising, but in some cities we had to expand the recruitment zone from a small target neighborhood to as much as half the city in order to get enough people into the pipeline. Expanded target communities, right, doesn't take long to figure this out. These are pretty big cities, Baltimore, Denver, Milwaukee, meant longer commutes for the people who were commuting to the suburban jobs because they had to get to designated transportation nodes where the vans would pick them up and take them out to the jobs. While employers were eager to hire the job seekers, naturally they had different shifts, right? When you're looking at metropolitan data, the aspect that the jobs actually occur at different times doesn't come into the equation. You just see the number of jobs. When you're actually trying to implement a program, suddenly shifts become really important. Some started at 7, some started at 8, some started at 9. All of that had to be built into the transportation. And of course, employers expected employees to stay late on occasion. Not such a big deal, but if you're providing transportation, suddenly you've got to figure out how you're going to provide a guaranteed job, a guaranteed ride home. When we conducted the final analysis after the demonstration ended, several key findings emerged. I thought it was very interesting, both in 90% of both the treatment group, the program group, and the control group worked during the 18 months of the demonstration. So very high labor force participation rates. Program participants did have higher earnings during the first quarter after random assignment, but that difference disappeared in subsequent quarters. Program participants were significantly more likely to get employer-provided health insurance through their main job during the demonstration. But the participants placed in suburban jobs soon left those jobs when they could find employment closer to home. Makes perfect sense, right? We concluded that reverse commute programs like the one we had designed were really not supportable in the long run because you had to really have them sustained through economic cycles. So through very strong demand and very weak demand, in which the transportation, job development, recruitment factors all would change dramatically as a result. And then sometimes the transportation would be extremely expensive in order to keep it going for those few times when there really was extreme spatial mismatch. So I conceived, launched, managed, and evaluated the demonstration. So that's the major mistake. I've tried to forget about it, but Chris was kind enough to remind me. So given my track record, what suggestions do I have today? I just have a few ideas. They're not meant to be comprehensive. They could be combined in some cases. They could stand alone in some cases. First is organizations really have to become expert on their economy and their labor market. This is one of the biggest weaknesses I see in the community employment field is people are really not conversant about what's going on in their economy, their labor market, and their community. One way of becoming expert is to identify 2 or 3 sectors in your local economy that you think really have sustained demand and could be appropriate targets for people in your community. Typical for people working in cities, healthcare, hospitality, education, social services, those sectors have not decentralized as much as construction, retail. Second strategy is to identify major institutions. These are not rocket science, but lots of times they're really not focused on the way they should be. Hospitals, universities. Again, these have tended to stay more in the central cities, even as suburbanization has taken place. My personal favorite, I've never seen this idea really turned into any kind of program or demonstration, is to consider how you could use informal employment networks in a kind of formal workforce development strategy. We all know that most people get jobs through coworkers, friends, family, yet in workforce development, we never really use those to our advantage. So even in the poorest communities, many adults work. Where do they work? In what sectors? In what institutions? What community institutions do they belong to? PTA, church, Little League. Is there a way of turning those informal associations in the community into job networks that unemployed people could take advantage of? What are the key barriers preventing neighborhood residents for qualifying for the jobs you've identified? Typically, this is education and skills. I would argue that in most communities, you're not going to find the institutions that can address those barriers in the community. One usually finds them as citywide or regional organizations that have developed the expertise that can really train and prepare people for jobs that require a 2-year degree or extensive skills training. Develop relationships with them. Figure out which ones are good, which ones are not good. Is mobility a key barrier? It may be that physical isolation in some cities is a key barrier, and you have to figure out how to address that. You might be able to persuade public transportation agencies to create a bus line if there's real concentration on both ends of the commute, but most likely you're going to have to figure out ways of helping people access cars that's affordable or some kind of carpooling, neither of which is necessarily that easy. And finally, in most low-income communities I've looked at, men are much more likely to have challenges in the labor market than women. A couple of the reasons they often work in the informal cash economy, but they have barriers to the formal economy in the form of child support orders and sometimes criminal records. If that's a real factor in your community, organizations have to become expert in those areas, and believe me, they are Byzantine areas to try to understand. The good news is that public agencies in both criminal justice and child support are eager to work with communities in an effort to keep people out of jail and to get them paying some modest forms of child support. So I'm going to stop there. Chris, I'm not sure who I hand it off to at this point.
Back to me.
Back to you. Okay. Thank you.
You can sit here because we're going to invite the panel.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. I assure you the idea of this was not to force you to relive all of your past flaws or failures. But we often, the mantra is that failure is instructive, and so we just wanted to benefit from your experience. I am now pleased to introduce Carol Coletta, who will be moderating today's session, and she will introduce the other panelists. Carol, until very recently, was for the past 6 years president of CEOs for Cities. In this role, Ms. Coletta helped change the urban conversation about cities as problems to one about the strengths of potential cities. She recently resigned to run a new initiative, Art Place, where she is working closely with major foundations and the National Endowment for the Arts to accelerate creative placemaking across America. And Carol will introduce our panel. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. Well, Chris and Mark have set the stage for our discussion with our panel and with our audience. I want to introduce our panelists, and I'll be brief. You have their bios in your packets. But to my left, representing the federal government, is Byron Zudema, the U.S. Department of Labor's Employment and Training Administration's regional administrator here in Chicago. Juan Salgado is president and CEO of the Instituto del Progreso Latino, which focuses on immigration integration and the creation of skilled and educated workers. Bob Goloth is next to him. He's vice president of the Center for Family Economic Success and Community Change at the Annie E. Casey Foundation. And Bob has worked this issue from a lot of different perspectives, not just the foundation perspective, but also from CDCs and from City Hall. So that's important. And then, of course, you've heard from Mark Elliott, president at Mobility. Now, if you have a question, periodically throughout this discussion, I'm going to stop and ask you if you have a comment, observation, a question, and I'll do that for each of our regional participating markets. I'll try to give you some warning that your moment is about to approach, but here in Chicago, when that moment comes and you have a question, I want you to be sure, in fact, I've been told to be really tough and vigilant about this. You have to hit your red button to get your microphone on, and then I want you to turn it off. And I also want you to identify yourself and your affiliation before you ask your question or make your observation. So, and that goes for everyone who is participating in this discussion this morning. So If you would do that for us, that will make things go more smoothly. And again, I'll try to give you some notice. So hang on to your questions and comments, write them down, because we really do want this to be an informal conversation. I loved what Chris said, focused but not constrained discussion. So we're going to work on that, Chris. Byron, I want to start with you. You know, Chris made the point about who do you call if you're calling Europe? Who do you call if you're calling the region? So talk about the administration's rollout of this regional strategy, and who do you call, and where are you seeing some good examples of interjurisdictional strategies at work?
Well, thank you. Good morning, and it's a pleasure to be here. I just want to respond to the concept that we are doing a low-budget operation here. I'm part of that low-budget operation. I work for the federal government, and I do that just across the street. So, it's very, very low budget and easy to have me here, which is probably why I'm here. On your agenda, you see that Assistant Secretary Jay Notes was scheduled to be here. She sends her regrets, but ended up with an afternoon meeting involving the White House and just couldn't get here and get back there physically. It's a pleasure to be here, and if in terms of the question about where's the administration, what's our commitment, our interest, this administration is incredibly committed and interested in the idea of neighborhoods and of population groups that become isolated in some of these neighborhoods. So starting at that very, very sort of micro level, the president himself, I guess we certainly know if we heard him on the campaign, and we've heard him speak since that time, has a real grassroots community-based kind of background, spent time doing that here in Chicago. The Secretary of Labor, Hilda Solis, Congresswoman out of California, is very, very focused on this whole idea that while we invest in America in some broad ways as the federal government and in a variety of other ways and institutions, nonetheless, what she heard loud and clear as a congresswoman in California is that all too often, if you will, kind of the usual suspects get that investment. Those who know how, the identified, the already sort of in place community leading groups and regional groups get the investment and others don't. So early on, and if you look at the Recovery Act, early on, the instructions that came out for planning for the Workforce Investment Act, the instructions that we put into the whole solicitation for over $500 million in green grants, another $250 in healthcare grants that came out of the Recovery Act, all had some very, very key elements. They talked about using approaches like Pathways Out of Poverty. They talked about ensuring that disconnected populations and disconnected communities geographically would become part of the emerging economy, whether it was in green jobs, health jobs, or other kinds of regional sector priorities. So from the beginning, I have seen a very, very focused discussion and very focused interest in that concept. In fact, it took a while before we really started talking more publicly about coming back to regional strategies, cluster strategies, and looking at bigger pictures. And so I would say if you look at where we are today, you will see that our budgets going forward, we're looking at making more investments in innovation kind of funding, not all of it just going out, if you will, by formula to the system, but putting out competitive grants and looking for organizations that can demonstrate these successes. That's built into our budget process. You will see that we continue to work on solicitations for community-based job training programs, for Pathways Out of Poverty, for investments like that. So in terms of the commitment and the focus, I think our attention is firmly on the idea that we need to pay attention to both. I mean, our focal point across the country for this would really be state and workforce investment board. So in every state in the country has a statewide workforce board, and probably importantly to this conversation, there's a scattering of regional area local workforce boards. those are the groups where these partnerships I've heard described need to happen, need to be strengthened in many places. It's where the synergy of in joint investment needs to be found, and paying attention, if you will, to the fact that what we've charged them with, I think, is really this. I think we've charged them with being aware of and planning on broad regional basis with a focus on community at a time, so that as we look at some significant multi-county or metro and collar kind of county area, we're saying it matters to understand resources and the options and opportunities in that overall region. And what further matters is that you get down to an understanding of community by community. How will that play? How will they participate?
Bob, let me turn to you. The research presented this morning indicates that spatial mismatch between where jobs are, where workers live, while it may remain a challenge, is by no means the only challenge in connecting residents of low-income communities to regional employment opportunities. And in your work, what have you found to be the other pressing challenges?
Great, thanks. Good morning. Just as an opener, I have to admit that I think as we have this conversation, we need to tease out a bit more this neighborhood, regional connection. I come out of kind of a traditional community development world where neighborhood means a geography. That's different. That plays out differently around the country, certainly on the West Coast. But we need to sort of think through what success in workforce means with that in mind. And frankly, an awful lot of public workforce and private workforce doesn't focus on neighborhood outcomes. And a good example of this, and this gets to some of the other issues, in East Baltimore where we work, if we were to equalize the rate of employment in that neighborhood of 25,000, 30,000 people with the city as a whole, we'd have to connect 1,000 people or more to jobs. So that starts getting a sense of scale. And the idea is with that many more people working in a neighborhood, you start changing how that neighborhood feels, the expectations, the role models, the income that multiplies in retail and so on. If we're just looking at individual adult success, population success, we may not get that. Now, I think there's a rub there, and I think we just need to get back to it. Some of the things I thought we have to pay attention to as well. One obvious one is skills. In the same East Baltimore neighborhood, about 80% of the people have less than a high school degree, and yet an awful lot of the jobs in cities and certainly in regions require much more than that. And when we did estimates just in healthcare and construction, somehow you have to squeeze out upwards of 1,000 hours of basic ed and training over time to get someone to a middle skill job or above. Well, that's a lot of lift, not simply financial resources, but where's that time come from families who are working? A second piece, and this is around another failure Mark and I shared together. On the west side of Chicago, we were involved in a project some of you may remember. It's kind of become an urban legend. The Austin Labor Force Intermediary Initiative called ALFI, and it seemed like a no-brainer. There were lots of small manufacturers out there, lots of them, lots of people in need of jobs, and why not connect them? Well, we never could quite connect them. There was a skill mismatch, there were racial barriers, there were networks. These were small firms without resources. We couldn't connect the right kind of public resources to that. So even in cities, even in a neighborhood itself, making these connections is difficult. Finally, one of the things we found in our community development work that we should have known, but we didn't, and that is that there's a huge amount of housing instability. And we've done 3 waves of surveys in about 10 cities in which 50–60% of people move every 3 years. Many people move more than once. Many people move more than 2 miles. Well, that kind of instability, which is both a cause and effect of lack of jobs, really undermines your ability to do neighborhood type work and to have a service level. Let me just end with one more, and that's sort of, it sort of hits you right in the head these days, and that is, are there enough jobs? And we'll get to it with shrinking cities, that discussion, but are there enough jobs in the city or the suburbs for people to connect to? And I think there's good and bad news on that. Last week we were sponsoring a meeting on job creation strategies, and there was one author who was really pointing to an uptick in manufacturing jobs. This is because of changes in energy prices, transportation, and so on. Well, for cities like Chicago or Minneapolis, this manufacturing resurgence may actually have some real opportunity in neighborhoods. And I think this kind of emphasizes what Mark said, that we really need to be careful about staying close to what's happening in the economy and where there are job opportunities to connect to. So let me stop with those, and I certainly could add some more, but I think that's probably enough.
Bob, let me just stick with you a minute. And do you feel, from a foundation perspective, that that the neighborhood conversation is well connected to the attempt to develop policy at a regional level?
Well, about when I started in the foundation world about 15 years ago, we designed a jobs initiative, and its essential characteristic was connecting neighborhoods to regional economies. Economies are regional, they're not neighborhoods. You've got to do that. So that's kind of a beginning piece. Now, that's the easy part. Now what do you do? I mean, is it spatial mobility? Is it, you know, where are those jobs? How do sectors locate themselves? Some are right by a neighborhood, some are far away. I would say I think it's changed for the better, but you know, there's multiple institutions that are involved in workforce. We've done some looks in the neighborhoods, and there's 14, 15 different streams of money, millions of dollars being spent, and they're not well connected. It's TANF, it's ABE, it's reentry, vocational education, and so on. They have different problem statements, different goals, different measures of progress, and nobody owns those funding streams altogether. I mean, the WIB owns some of them, but there's many of them. Well, how do you marshal all that to create an effort that then connects to regions? I would also say that we've worked over that 15 years in inner ring suburbs, and we've taken a look at some of the housing mobility strategies like moving to work. And there really are some similar issues no matter where you are. It's how do you connect to those jobs? Is there service provision that really is delivered in an effective kind of way? Who's your advocate in doing this kind of work? Same kind of problems. So I think we need to look at the neighborhood issue across the whole metro area, not simply neighborhood to region, thinking as city to the regional level.
Mm-hmm. Juan, you're out there. Did you want to respond?
Well, just and probably in the ongoing conversation, this idea of are there enough jobs, and it just gets confusing, because no matter how many ways we slice this data, it seems to come down to much more the idea of are there enough jobs with you know, the right requirements in the right place at the right time. And so we hear kind of broadly from a variety of employers and industries saying, there just aren't people. You know, this makes no sense. We've got this high unemployment rate, and I've got these standing vacancies that never get filled. And then on the other hand, we have these significant population groups that are both dislocated, as we talked about earlier, and the just unemployed, long-term unemployed. And the mismatch of those concepts, I think, is still not well understood, and takes, I think, this both broad regional understanding of the numbers and then continually localizing them first in geographic areas, and then start to stratify them based against things like, you know, age, education, ethnicity, and all the other things, and trying to see if we can sort out what's going on here. Why do we have this kind of mismatch?
Well, this is particularly true in manufacturing, where you know, there's just been launched a new federal initiative, but it's interesting. As much as manufacturers say there's a mismatch and everything else, they say we're not going to pay for that. You know, don't expect us to do the training. You've got to deliver somebody with the right kind of skills, the job readiness, and everything else. So it's I think you're right, it presents a real challenge, and it's kind of an irony that in this environment, you'd have people saying skill shortages. I mean, I think that's the long-term issue, but in that sector, it's really, really present.
And Juan, you're dealing with skill shortages. I mean, your efforts on the ground are aimed at that. I'd like for you to comment on what you believe is working, and also, you know, Bob said he didn't finish his list of things that he would put on the list as challenges in addition to where we started, the spatial mismatch. But I'd like to hear the things that would be on your list.
Sure. So I like to think of ourselves as the how-to manual, if you will, because of our own experience as an organization. And not just the how-to manual of how do we get people with the right skills and the right networks, but in some ways how we have to reorganize ourselves. We're a community organization. We're a 33-year-old community organization, but in many ways we're a networked organization. And so we don't just live and breathe in a community. We're working and networking across the region. And in many ways, while governments may be challenged to figure this out because they're locked into their geographies, and companies are locked into their bottom lines, we're locked into the growth and development of human beings. And so, we can sustain an effort over a longer period of time, where an employer may be hiring now, a different employer may be hiring later. If we've got the right remedy, if we've got the right solution, we can be there for the long haul. And I think that one of the things that we have done, and I think it's important to look at this frame of communities adding regional value, because they're coming into it with the human capital in their communities, and they're not stopping there. In our case, we went from asking people in an adult learning center, where do you work? How do we help you where you work, which were local manufacturers, to working on a Ford supplier park hiring process, where we were able to be very successful, to now working with the city to run the city's workforce center for manufacturing, where we're working with lots of employers, adding value to those employers, and bringing people along through the process so they can access those jobs. Similarly, in the healthcare sector, and when you talked about pick a couple sectors, the how-to manual for us is we pick the sector where our people were already working to figure out how to get them ahead. We pick the sector where they desire to work, which is healthcare, both important sectors to our economy. And then, once again, grow folks in a way that, and I say networked organization. Obviously, we've got to get the academic work done. We've got to do that fast. We've proven to do that. Obviously, we've got to move people along career paths where they exist and get them into those middle skill jobs. But equally important, in a networked organization, people have to be connected. And we have to create the kinds of mechanisms that allow them to be connected. So I really think about, and that means connected to the private sector and opportunity. So I really think about, one of the things that we may be missing in this conversation, or we may be missing in the solutions, is thinking about how we traditionally, I think it's important in this session, where we have community developers, to know that community developers like us need to also redefine how we operate in space. And part of that process is figuring out how the private sector and the relationships in the private sector, the educational sector, that is our space. We need to be active in it, we need to be proactive in it, and we need to be formative in it. I mean, we are living in a situation where often the public institutions aren't delivering the value they were intended to at the beginning. And so we need to be in a position to challenge those institutions by our very own work. And so I think that and the private sector is very hungry to see new models that actually function for them. They're hungry to actually see that skilled worker arrive at their door. And so, yes, they're pushing that work upon us, I think it's an opportunity for us in community development to seize that moment and take advantage of it.
I'm wondering in your work, how have you looked at this idea that if you've got a geographic neighborhood and there are significant numbers of people there who would work, need this training, you're starting to make these connections, some of them might be nearby, some of them are doing the community now coming back in. At the end of the day, though, are you looking at what's happening as the conglomerate community? So as people try to get out there and work, when they're coming back, when they're home in the evening, when they're there around the weekend, I mean, what's happening to recreate a different thing that happens there? Everything from, sort of the playground to the community institution to the kitchen table conversations in families. So for just doing jobs, and something happens in that job. I think one of the experiences we have in looking at, the low-income adult program, the TANF programs, and so forth, is that you can get people out there, and then if there's not this whole community effort, which sort of starts right there at the private kitchen table and ultimately includes institutions and the environment in which folks live, they can quickly and easily sort of fail on the job. How does that look?
We talk about 3 ladders. I could argue with you that the most important ladder is the third. There's an academic ladder, there's a career ladder, and there's a social ladder. And if your programs don't account for the social ladder equal to the academic and the career ladder, then you're missing something incredibly important. One of our biggest job developers are the graduates of our program. Because they're out there and they're recruiting people and they have an investment in the people that they recruit, so they want to get those people jobs. So it becomes part of the networked organization. I think that, and when you care about the social ladder, you care that people are connected to multiple institutions. So you're very proactive in making sure that this whole idea that this is, in some ways, my asset, right? My organization's asset, right? Or my organization's talent. That's furthest from what we're trying to do. What we're trying to do is turn that asset into everyone's asset, the church's assets, the neighboring organization's assets. So when we have one of our nursing graduates goes from making $8 an hour or no income to making $22 to $24 an hour, the first people we connect them to are the local housing organization that can actually help them to save money so that they can buy a home, right? So it's those kinds of connections. And they're going to convince them to buy a home in the community, right? So that we strengthen the fabric of local communities. So I think that the networked organization is looking not just to network itself, right, but to network every single human being that it comes into contact.
And there certainly you may have good examples to share as well, and I think that's something that I would invite you to share with the panel and with others here participating. I'm going to go to you in just a few minutes. I do want to ask Mark. I want to come back to you. I think it was a point you made, and not Chris, talking about jobs on the far periphery, and. Yeah, it's a quick question. Just wondering if you know enough about those jobs to know how many of them were construction jobs, which you sort of think are really not coming back.
Yeah, I actually don't know the details.
Okay, all right. Just be an interesting thing to find out.
I would guess yes, but I'm not.
I would too, but who knows? You were, I thought, very brave to come and share a story about failure. Thank you very much. And that
several to choose from. So
well, perhaps you'll.
It reminded me of another I'd forgotten about.
If we need to fill time, maybe you could share some more. But in the meantime, that failure, if you will, that learning experience was built on an assumption that proved not to be the case. And I'm wondering what else you think today that we might be assuming that we're building action on, that we're acting on, where the fundamental assumption may simply be wrong.
Well, I think it's always hard to know in advance, right? I mean, the evidence at the time was pretty powerful that the spatial mismatch was a real issue. And I think it was a real issue.
You just couldn't serve it.
But it doesn't mean that you can design a program that's going to address that challenge. Right, so I think a lot of times, I see this all the time in academic research, is they're operating at such a high level in talking about what the trends are and what the issues are and how we need to respond, they have absolutely no idea about how to design a program that would actually address that. And I think we have to, as you know, I'm much more on the community development side of this equation than the academic side. Chris forced me to write the paper, so, but the jobs are growing fastest at the periphery. I don't care. I'm not going to try to solve that issue, right? There's still jobs in the central city that I can focus on, or in the inner ring suburbs that I can focus on. I don't need to worry, even though the academics are saying, employment growth was 17% in the outermost ring and only 1% in the central city. You think, oh, well, we got to give up on cities. No, you don't have to give up on cities, but you've got to be smart about how you approach what the opportunities are and whether you can design something that's going to address those challenges. That program design and implementation is by far the biggest challenge we face as a field.
Bob, you look like you want to jump in. And then we're going to go to Boston.
Well, I just wanted to add, when you look at some of the data that the Urban Institute shared, at least before the recession in the suburbs, you had full employment or better. Some of it in some places was 2-3%. And my experience is from the 90s is when you get very low unemployment, everybody becomes good. They start doing things, employers do things they wouldn't normally do, lots of policymakers. And I do think on the periphery, we need to have building of affordable housing in the region as a complement to city-based strategies or inner ring strategies, and we just shouldn't take that off the table. Now, it's not a poverty solution in and of itself, but it makes a lot of sense, and there may be some of the kinds of stakeholders, given employment rates out there, that could help make this happen.
Let me go to a question in Boston.
Are there questions here or comments from folks here in Boston? I think one example that I'm aware of here in Boston, that one of our panelists in Boston, Jerry Rubin from Jewish Vocational Services, Mark talked about using informal networks to try and integrate into the formal system. And I think something interesting that Jewish Vocational Services is doing is working with a network of an Industrial Areas Foundation affiliate, the Greater Boston Interfaith Organization, on trying to integrate folks from that network into the workforce development programs that they're running.
Oh, okay. Hello. Sorry, this isn't a question.
Could you identify yourself and your affiliation?
Yeah, so this will be a comment. So if this is time for comments and questions, I guess this falls into the comment category. My name is Jerry Rubin, and I'm President and CEO of Jewish Vocational Service. We are a regional labor market intermediary. So we are one of the larger workforce development organizations in the Boston area, provide services to about 20,000 people a year. And we work both sides of the labor market, the pre-employment and education, job readiness side, and then we do incumbent worker career advancement services as well. And I would say our regional relationships are largely with major employers in the Boston area, as well as educational institutions, all of whom are regional players that are not particularly local neighborhood players. However, we do have several relationships that try and network connections between neighborhood individuals and our connections to regional employers and educational networks. And I can talk about a couple of them. For one, we ourselves are located at the nexus of every major T-line in the city, so that actually to access our offices is probably for most of the individuals that come to our offices at most a 15 or 20 minute public transportation trip. But that said, there are some interesting reasons to connect to informal networks, and Bob mentioned one. We have a partnership with a group of Haitian churches that are affiliated with Greater Boston Interfaith Organization that is an IAF affiliate. And our work there is basically running 5 levels of English for Haitian speakers, all of designed to get people either into one of three next steps, either into a job training program, or into a Bridges to College program. It's a very interesting relationship. The churches organize the individuals, do the recruiting, and we do the servicing. We have a similar model with now just starting with adult ed, bridging to college, with the largest provider of GED, sir. We're a GED provider, but the largest provider of GED in the city is doing the same thing. These are hub and spoke models. GBIO is more of started out as an informal relationship, and all these models are now being formalized. But I think they're interesting ways to link the neighborhoods to what's essentially a regional labor market and also a regional education market, because at least in Boston, the biggest gap is education and skills. It's just a huge skills mismatch between the jobs and the good jobs. And so it's not just a regional labor market, it's also a regional education market because the colleges are regional.
Good, thanks. Are there questions in the room or comments? Yes, make sure you hit your mic and tell us who you are and who you're affiliated with.
Good morning. I'm Deborah Bennett with the Polk Brothers Foundation. And Bob, I wanted to pick up on a comment that you made earlier about the Austin labor force intermediary. And
mic on? I don't think your mic is on.
I heard it.
You can hear her, but others around the country cannot if her mic is not on.
We can hear her. It's on. Okay.
Oh, you can hear her. Okay, great. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Bob, you talked about race being a factor in the failure of the Austin labor force intermediary. I was at Shorebank at the time, and I think we were completely blindsided that race would be such a big factor, and basically the manufacturers on the west side did not want to hire the African-American Austin residents. There's also Diva Pager's more recent work about employers not wanting to hire African-American workers or job seekers. So my question is really, how do we address this, and how do we address it, particularly without pitting different peoples against each other? How do we address it without pitting low-income Latino workers against African-American workers, which was the case in Austin? And how do we address it when, often we don't even want to acknowledge that this is a real issue?
Well, that is a huge issue, Deborah. And, one thing I didn't mention that's kind of an unfortunate regularity that we still have is a lot of studies on employment discrimination from Urban Institute and others sort of state consistently that 1 out of 5 folks going in for a job, and this is Hispanic or African American, there's some kind of discrimination in terms of job offer, wages, and so on. So it's a lot of, you add that up, and that's a lot of circumstances. I think there's a couple levels you work at. Juan mentioned one is how do you create a network, sort of this intermediary network that really engages employers, adds value, and is able to, if not break down, kind of push open those doors. We saw a lot of that happening in tight labor markets, in labor markets where there's lots of choices. A lot of folks revert back to those old behaviors. So that's one. But I think there's also a community-wide effort that has to happen around this. If in business and others are serious about building a workforce, and the workforce right now and certainly in the future is going to be of color largely, we've got to sort of confront that as part of not simply a neighborhood or city effort, but of a regional effort if we're serious about kind of future competitiveness and so on. So it's a big issue, and one we need to always have on the table with these other strategies.
I think it opens the door, though, for nonprofit organizations to really vouch for these job seekers. When Diva Pager did her study, it was just an African-American, Hispanic, white going in without anybody vouching for them. And so employers were left to draw their own conclusions. When you have an organization like Instituto representing that, hey, this person's been through our program, I've seen them every day, they don't miss, they're on time, I'm telling you that this is a good person you should really take a look at. that can begin to address at the micro level that kind of issue. Where we get on the macro level, is a conversation will go on for many more years. But here, for practical solutions, I think this is a really important role that all of us can play when we're actually working directly with job seekers.
And I think we have to we have to look inward too to make sure that we're doing everything we can across neighborhoods. I'll use the example. We run today the city's Workforce Center for Manufacturing. Consistently, half of our placements, of our 500 placements a year, have been African American, not Latino. These are folks going into manufacturing. Just got through with a major hiring initiative at the Solo Cup Company, and a large number working with the city of Chicago. Well over, little over 50% are African American workers going into manufacturing right now, making a pretty decent wage. Our average wage is about $12 to $13 an hour. Now, it isn't lost upon me that perhaps we're able, as a Latino serving organization, to get in the door. That may in fact be the case. It also isn't lost upon me that at one point, as a Latino serving organization, we had to take the first names out of people's resumes because if it was a female name, they were pigeonholed into certain jobs. If it was a male name, there was different things. So it's not just a race discrimination. So we started to put J. Ramirez, right, or M. Ramirez instead of Maria Ramirez, because you get the entree into the particular job. And so, but I think at the end of the day, if we're entering into the work with the right mindset, that is, the danger in doing neighborhood-based work is that all we care about is our neighborhood. But if we, in fact, care about the region because we know that that's how we're going to get jobs to grow so that more of our people can get the jobs, and if we care about our neighbors, then I think we can do the kind of work that is high road work. And there aren't just high road practices in companies, there's high road practices in community organizations. And I think that ought to be more conversation among the foundation community about rewarding high road practices and about getting communities to take advantage of what they're doing today. So, one of our challenges in the future is to take some of the models that we're doing and apply them in other communities.
I would also say on that front, we need to reward and recognize those businesses that really are out there putting effort into doing it. A labor economist, Mark Bendick, once said to me that if you look at the labor market, there's about 10–15% of employers who are just terrific on diversity and hiring. There's about 20% that are just bottom feeders that need to be slapped around to get them to do the right thing. And then there's a whole bunch in the middle that if a nonprofit is really there with the right kind of service, the right kind of connection, it can make a real difference. So I think you're absolutely right. That's the area that we really need to make progress on and figure out those sectors and firms where we can really add value and give the kind of resources that are needed to make it happen.
Is this another opportunity for that idea of the intersection of the reality of region and neighborhood based because companies are neighborhood based too somewhere. I mean, they have their own neighborhood they live in. They attract people to come and work there. There's the whole commute cost, proximity, everything that most people think about. And I don't know, but it seems to me at least one of the things we push through our planning processes and they may or may not be incredibly successful is coming to employers with this kind of regional profile that essentially says, so you're in the market to grow your business, you've got these openings, you've got these plans, you think things are going to go on, you expect to grow and prosper, and yet here's the labor market reality, back to using unemployed people, dislocated workers, even the employed, and starting to look at how you profile them. Start to get a profile down to even like the Puma level of where is the talent, if you will, in a regional economy. And then essentially you're painting both a social interest, which is really good, but you're also painting, I think, an economic picture that says you aren't getting to where you want to go. if you aren't interested in investing in this fully diverse workforce. It just, the numbers aren't there for you. So, I mean, I think it's good to appeal to have people do the right thing for good reasons. I think that when we're dealing with companies, especially of investors and shareholders and everything else, we also have to give them an economic case. And in some cases, I believe we can say you're not going there if you won't engage the workforce fully.
Yeah, I think, Juan, you made that very point in terms of your approach to value and creating value for everyone, and I think it's a good one. I'll tell you what, let me come back to you. I have someone in Minneapolis who has a question or comment, and then I'll be back to you.
Lenny's going to start us out. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and one of us will get to you with a mic.
My name is Lenny Chisholm, Springboard Economic Development Corporation. In Springboard's presentation to the GAO last week for the coming U.S. DOT report that's due out in September 2011 to other congressional staffers, the $72 billion that the U.S. DOT spends every year is failing to reach minority workers and companies. This is a major issue because the infrastructure in America is changing, and the jobs will be producing over $100 billion annually in the coming years. What policy changes would you suggest to equalize the usage of minority companies and workers for these U.S. DOT jobs, which are provided to equalize the unemployment in the rural communities? This is a self-employment opportunity for minorities in the workforce.
Who on the panel has a comment? Bob?
Yeah, there's one approach that's been developed for Department of Transportation. They, in most DOT projects, they have the option to spend 0.5% of some amount of their money on training activities, and the Coalition 10 that's part of the Gamaliel Network, organizing network, has really pushed for the utilization of that 0.5% around the country. The best example is in Missouri, so that actually you can not only negotiate for a certain amount of jobs around particular projects and business opportunities, but you then can get some resources to establish the kinds of apprenticeship programs and so on that are needed to make it work. That's starting to spread. I mean, we have a lot of experience in the U.S. with community benefit agreements, linkage agreements. There's not as much success that we'd want in terms of actually connecting them to real people and jobs. The other thing I'd say quickly, we did a survey recently with Aspen Institute of pre-apprenticeship construction programs, which have to be part of this equation. And there's actually quite a lot of them. Unfortunately, what we found was that most pre-apprenticeship programs neither connect to apprenticeships or to jobs. That's kind of a problem. You've got to make that connection. And even more disheartening for apprentices of color, the dropout rates or non-completion rates in union apprenticeships, which we often think of as the gold standard of getting people in, is 50–60% of folks don't complete it. So we have a lot of work to do to make this not simply capturing the opportunity, creating the programs, but making sure that people are supported to complete those programs and really get the payoffs from them.
I am coming back to you, but hang on 1 minute because I have a comment or question in Houston. And let's go first to San Francisco, then to Houston. San Francisco?
Yeah, we are. Are you picking us up?
Yes, we are.
Great. Hey, fantastic panel so far. We're going to ask for your indulgence here. We're going to do 3 rapid-fire questions.
Okay, rapid
so
fire. And do you want us to hold our answers until the end?
Yes, please.
Okay, great.
Okay. Let's go start with the gentleman here.
My name is Joseph Devereaux. I'm with Transfer Engineering and Builders. We build worldwide, and the issue worldwide is a need for construction workers. In foreign countries, we find Chinese workers, we've imported Filipino workers. In this country, we have difficulty training workers because of the conflict between the union requirements and the requirements of our community for training. And pre-apprenticeships are a bugaboo for what we're trying to do. And that needs to be addressed by Byron at USDA.
Second question?
Hi, my name is Tara Marchand, and I am with Emerald. Emerald Cities, Oakland, and we actually work on joining workforce development programs with labor programs, pre-apprenticeship programs. But my question is actually in reference to what the gentleman said before, which is when you talk about high skills, or skills aren't there, manufacturing and technology, are you also encouraging policies that would support not bringing in external workers from other countries, because we're not investing locally in those schools, colleges, and to what degree do we have to work collectively to ensure that we do have benefits localized?
Okay, our last question here.
Quick question on the innovation grants that you mentioned for the Workforce Investment Act. You mentioned that going through the local workforce investment boards. If we're looking at regionalism and neighborhoods, would you entertain opening that up to community-based intermediaries, local school districts, community colleges, rather than going through workforce investment board?
Great, thank you guys. We'll put it back on mute.
And identify yourself, the last comment or question.
Neil Kelly, California Department of Education.
Great, thanks. Byron, I want to give you, let's start at the bottom, and I'll give you the innovation grants question.
Thank you. The innovation grants, first of all, I'm actually talking about two things. There are, in the budget process, the identification of innovation funds going forward, and so we have an opportunity to continue to shape those. They are going to at least be patterned on successful lessons we think we've had and strategies we've adopted over the past. So to the specific question, who will get the grant money? And in this case, I think there will be diverse organizations who get it. We will want local workforce investment boards involved in this process. Over time, we've gone from, you don't have to have a board if you don't want to have a board, pick a community group, pick anyone, and just move. We've gone to only local workforce boards, and I think that, overall, we're beginning to come together on this idea. It's about the partnership. It's about the community coming together. So since we invest in local workforce boards in a variety of other ways, we think and believe they should be at the table. They should be in this partnership. But community colleges, universities, community-based groups, a wide variety of nonprofits are certainly going to be part of this innovation strategy. So I think what I can say, and that we are doing, in fact, listening sessions, have done some around the country to get more ideas, but we think we probably have a pattern here that works, and it is this community pattern of partners coming together. So that's how I think the innovation grants are going to be moving forward.
Great. Juan or Mark, do you want to take the skills question?
Well, she's about policy, and are we going to be shutting down, if you will, the high skill pipeline by focusing on growing our own? I don't think it's an either-or choice. I think that you have to look at the employer, and you have to realize that the employer needs to be getting what they need today, they need to get what they need tomorrow, and they need to get what they need 10, 15 years from now. And so we have to be prepared to do all of the above if we're in fact going to have a vibrant and growing economy. So I think that our policy has to be aligned to fill jobs by any means necessary when they are available, but be committed to the pipeline. We decided to create a nursing pipeline, despite the fact that there's lots of nurses being brought in, because we have the talent. Now we have to build it fast enough so that perhaps we don't have to bring so many people into our local economies. But in fact, we're not there yet, so we got to get there.
Good, very helpful. Bob, will you take the construction question since you had addressed that earlier?
Yeah, if I understand it, there's certainly, as a baseline, the building trades unions have not been friendly to many communities over the years, although I think for those of us who work with them, they've gotten a lot better at this. And It's hard to see this now with, record levels of unemployment in the construction field, but there's a real aging out process that's going to be happening as we recover. And given the investments in green and the rebuilding of metro areas over the next number of decades, there's real opportunity there. My sense is the apprenticeship system in general is the best the U.S. has to offer in terms of a training program that reaches folks with high school level skills, and we really ought to build on it and make it work for everyone. That's going to take some work, but it's a good model. Employers invest in it, unions invest in it. It's an earn and learn. It's a really good model that people can move up with, and it's transparent. We've just got to make it work. When you look at non-union apprenticeships, oftentimes they train lots of people, but a lot of those features aren't there. Rehiring, benefits, a career ladder, who pays for the training. A lot of those fall on the worker in some sense. So it's a challenging question. It gets answered differently in different locales depending upon union history and the building trades, but it's well worth working on to make it work for everybody.
Did you want to jump in?
Just two quick things on this topic of apprenticeship. Just to the caller, I mean, I don't know your community, I don't know your specific situation, but first of all, not all apprenticeships, not all registered apprenticeships, even within the Department of Labor, are labor organized. So I heard there was maybe some concern about we don't quite gel all the time with the union. This is not meant to imply this go around them, but in many cases there are registered apprenticeships that are not union-based. There are many that are, and I guess if there are specific connections in the California area that need to be made indirectly, if that person can get to me, I can call people in California and work on that. But I hear the interest, and it probably is something that needs to be worked out.
And how does someone get to you?
They get to me, they get to me by calling 312-596-5403.
Okay.
And I will get them a number back in San Francisco. And quickly on what we would refer to as the Foreign Labor Certification Program, when we're bringing in people from other places to work, we're charging fees to employers to do that, commonly referred to in the vernacular as the H-1B fees. And you will see that we have done in the past, and we are doing another round of investments to actually use the fees to put back into training programs to do just what Juan is talking about, to say, in fact, if we're still paying to import software engineers, healthcare workers, or whatever, we also ought to invest in training American workers to fill those slots. So I hear that, and it is a strategy we're aware of, and we're actually making investments in.
Great. Let's go to Houston.
Hi, this is Amanda Tim, the Executive Director of the LISC office in Houston, and I have 6 questions from our audience, so I wanted to know what our limit is, and I'll definitely rapid fire.
If they're rapid fire, let's take 3 of them, and then we'll see if we have time for the other 3.
Great, thanks. The first question is from our local Council of Governments representative. So speaking of connecting neighborhoods to the larger labor market, we haven't heard this morning much about pre-K to 12 public education system. What role does or should the system play in this type of development? The second question is from one of our foundation representatives here. Is there coordination with HUD and low-income tax credit programs and the states and regions? Specifically, do any of the states represented here give points in their qualified application process for locating housing near jobs versus locating it in low-income neighborhoods that are already lacking jobs? And our third question from one of the employees of the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas is, do you know of any initiatives in which community colleges are working directly with employers so that there is a structured and coordinated path to employment for the community college graduates? Thanks.
Good, thank you. And hold on to the other 3 questions. We need to invite a couple of other cities into the conversation, and we'll circle back to you. Community colleges question.
We're doing that in Chicago right now. I think I think that it's important for the colleges in many cases to have partners that do have a regional reach, and so our role with the college is to be the conduit with the Metropolitan Chicago Healthcare Council and the Regional Hospital Association. The college's role is to work with the specific hospitals on the curriculum, and so I think for us to do this effectively, this is a place where we do need to have more coordination and greater networks. And I think similar to what happens with CBOs is if every community college is working with the industry and every CBO is working with the industry, we end up wearing out the industry, and we need to come up with a better strategy for all of us to be working with the industry and all of us to be adding value to the industry and being held accountable to our constituencies and the industry for making the bridge.
Yeah, so who takes responsibility for that? Because you've been talking about networked organizations, connections, the importance of connections. That's been reinforced on the panel. And yet I often find there's not a lot of financial support for connections or for networking. So in a situation like that, who takes the lead for getting everyone around the table and having that conversation? I think your point's really well made. But then is there a natural leader, or is it the leader that simply takes it on as an organization? You're nodding.
I just think that is one of this whole idea, if you're going to call Europe, who do you call, is the same question. If I want to talk to the Chicago region, who am I talking to? If I want to talk to the Houston economy, what's the phone number, and who will I end up with on the other end? And so I do think that it is this idea of networking and intersecting organizations. There are somewhat different characteristics around the country. Certainly here in the Midwest, we've done a lot of talking, thinking, discussing about regionalism and when it's what's good about it and what's evil about it. But at the end of the day, there is still in most places no one organization that gets to be the region. It is almost always a networked group of organizations, and it is in an ideal setting a community collaborative group that comes together. There might be a chair or a leader or a facilitator, but even that person is not in charge of the region. So right. I think this is I think it is developing these sort of networks that says when you need this, you can touch this place in the network. When you need something else, you may be tapping into a slightly different place in the network.
Bob?
This is a really key issue. How do you organize these sector industry partnerships? And we've spent a lot of time on that. Many national funders and now many local funders, particularly, I know I saw some Boston colleagues on the video, as well as the Bay Area, have put together funds locally and nationally. Nationally, it's called the National Fund for Workforce Solutions, that literally provides flex dollars that gets reinvested with local dollars in these kind of local partnerships. And having the ability to, it's really about community organizing. How do you organize the businesses? How do you organize the community college, the CBOs? How do you put them together? How do you keep them on track for ambitious outcomes? This costs money, and it doesn't quite fall into a lot of the categorical public funding programs, although those programs are absolutely key to make it work. And I think this is a particular role philanthropy can play. Now, the platforms are different, but very often it's a nonprofit that has a particular interest in a sector that has developed industry knowledge that plays this role. The other thing I would just say to that question on community colleges, the Aspen Institute recently has put out a whole series of case studies with Mott Foundation funding on community college CBO partnerships in various industries with some really good data on effectiveness. A good example is Capital Idea in Austin, Northern Virginia Community College. Most of these are in healthcare, but you might want to go on their website to take a look at those case studies. They're really pretty good.
On the website of?
The Aspen Institute is the Workforce Strategies Group.
Good. All right. Now, we had two other questions from Houston. I don't want to ignore them. One was where's pre-K in this, pre-K to high school, and I mean, that seems an obvious answer. It's there as fundamental to workforce development, but somebody may want to say more.
Right, it is. I mean, you gotta, I think for all of us, we need to work on that younger generation coming up into jobs as well as the adult generation. To my mind, one of the most effective new efforts that's trying to put together these pieces is called Strive, not the job readiness Strive from Harlem, but the Strive from Cincinnati. That's a cradle to career, what they call collective impact effort, to really galvanize the community around young people moving up kindergarten readiness, third grade reading, high school entry, and moving into post-secondary, and really getting civic leaders and others to really invest in those set of outcomes with a report card. There's been a lot of efforts to do this, but this is actually starting to show some results and starting to spread around the country. I know Houston, for one, has been in a pilot with Living Cities, but there's many others that are trying this, and there's no reason you can't have neighborhood pilots within that. Most of these tend to be regional, to really bring together school systems and businesses and others on a regional basis. But there's no reason in a city or a particular part of town you couldn't do a pilot that reinforces that overall effort.
Then there was also the question about HUD and the coordination of HUD and states. And anybody have a comment?
It's a good idea.
It's a good idea. Okay, moving on. I do want to invite Pittsburgh and Los Angeles into the conversation. Then I'm coming back here, back to Minneapolis, and back to Houston. Any questions or comments from Pittsburgh and Los Angeles?
Does anybody have any questions I can come over to you, or comments? We don't have any questions at Pittsburgh.
Okay. Was that Pittsburgh? Okay.
Yes.
And Los Angeles?
Hi, this is Melody Nava in Los Angeles. And we have a question from the California Community Foundation from Ann Sewell, who's the president of the Land Trust there. And the question is, if the old planning approach was that jobs were in centers and housing spread out from those centers, and transit focused on getting people into centers, what are the new models? And are federal transit and economic development programs responsive to new models?
Okay. Well, Mark strikes out. He is like, no, tried that. Been there, done that. I do think it's important to understand that there's still far more job accessibility for those in the center of metropolitan areas than those on the periphery. And if I think the mismatch that hasn't been talked about is the tenure in jobs and the length of a mortgage. And that's a real conundrum when you look at it. But we'll save that for another day. But it is interesting that you're far closer to more jobs by living in the center than, again, on the periphery, where you may be more accessible to a job. But Bob, you look like you wanted to jump in with something.
I don't know if I want to jump in, but certainly my understanding of the whole sustainable communities effort of HUD and other agencies is to grapple with just that question of kind of for the 21st century metro areas. What's this connection between housing and transportation and jobs and so on? And I think there's a lot of energy around figuring that out. I haven't, for one. There's some places that seem to have it better than others given legacy transportation investments, but I think the story's yet to be told on that.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. I think there's lots of attention in wanting to look at it, but few, if any, answers. Some hypotheses here and there. I mean, not only does work no longer match the mortgage, it doesn't really match lifelong health care policies and all these other aspects of the idea that we go to work, we work for 30 years, we've got paid health, 30 years is roughly what most people want to do the mortgage on the house for, et cetera, et cetera. You take all those things now and you break it down and say, even if you live in a core city and you have lots of job probabilities, still the equally even higher probability is that you will not be fastened to any one of those jobs for any significant period anymore.
Right.
That you will have 4 years and 5 years and 3 years and 2 years, and you will move through these jobs. And how does that relate to all these other policies we have about how we finance homes and everything else?
Well, you're actually getting at a concern I had when I looked at the agenda originally, because it's almost too narrow a policy confine, right, to try to deal with employment and training, and all of you have been pointing this out all along. So, then there's transportation. But there's housing. But there's the policies that we have that cause us to build certain kinds of transportation infrastructure and incentivize big mortgages. So all of those things, I think it's the challenge of dealing with these multiple layers of complexity, policy upon policy, and I think that's, this is what's so tough. I want to go here. I didn't forget you.
I don't feel forgotten.
Thank you.
Maybe this is for Bob or Mark. My name is Howard Snyder. I'm Executive Director of Northwest Side CDC in Milwaukee. A very serious candidate for the U.S. Senate in Wisconsin and the CEO of a major corporation, a Fortune 500 company, has suggested tying public funding for the Workforce Investment Board and for the Milwaukee Area Technical College to reforming Milwaukee Public Schools. There's a threat on the one hand that you could remove public funding if you don't hit benchmarks. On the other hand, there's the carrot that that the WIB and the MATC could do better if they would be working on comprehensive education reform in the city. And I wondered if there was any data or if there were examples or studies, either in Chicago or in the region, of efforts, we won't call them threats, we'll call them efforts, to link education reform to workforce investment boards and tech colleges.
Well, I'm on the Workforce Investment Board in New York. I'm actually on the executive committee, so I get to take part in a lot of the conversations about the WIB budget. It's probably the biggest local WIB budget in the country. I think this year we're expecting about $50 million in federal WIA funding. The New York City school budget is about $10 billion. The idea that the WIB would go to the local Board of Education and say, we can really help you work on schools, I mean, we probably couldn't get in the door. Okay. It's not even the tail, it's the last hair of the tail on trying to wag the dog. I think the schools, there's so many issues we could focus on, right? Schools obviously are central to this conversation. In some ways, for many of the people we focus on, it's the failure of the schools or their experience in schools that's resulted in the challenges they face in the labor market. But we have enough on our plate, if I'm speaking to people who are in workforce development or employment, without having to really try to figure that part out. We've got to figure out our own piece of this first. There are very, very, very few proven successful workforce development programs in the country. Very few.
Yes, I'll take this question, then we'll go back to Minneapolis. Go ahead.
I just want to respond to your comment. My name is Sharon Bush. I'm with the Lloyd A. Fry Foundation here in Chicago. And in Chicago, we're trying out a new model as it relates to our workforce board, which is called the Chicago Workforce Investment Council. And what it is it's a coordinating agency that will try to coordinate all of the funds which come into the city for workforce development, not only Workforce Investment Act funds. So it will include that. Prior to the mayoral transition, Mayor Daley chaired the board of the Workforce Investment Council, which was really helpful and influential in getting the workforce board to work with the Chicago Public Schools and look at reform efforts within the Chicago Public Schools and to think about a pipeline kind of model. So it was the mayor needed to chair it. It's yet to be seen how it will transition, but it is an attempt to look at all aspects of the system and not just Workforce Investment Act.
Great. Let's go here and then back to Minneapolis. Go ahead.
Okay, Joel Bookman with LISC Chicago and the Institute.
Juan mentioned previously that we need to be ready to fill the jobs 10 or 15 years from now. We have a tendency in our country and locally to react to the last crisis rather than to be thinking ahead. So I guess to hear that job expansion in the exurbs is what's going on right now is interesting, but I'm wondering what is being done to think about those jobs 10 to 15 years from now. What are we doing to prepare for that? I'm interested, Juan, what your thinking is along those lines, but also what may be underway around the country.
Great.
Well, I think it goes back to the tried and true. If you're networked into the institutions that are thinking about it, then you can get an early start on where they're heading. I mean, like one of the big things that the Metropolitan Chicago Healthcare Council is working on right now is this transition of medical records into these data systems. They're choosing a provider. We're tuned into all of those conversations, and we don't exactly know where it's going to morph and head. So it's kind of like an organism, and you're a part of the organism. And I think that the big challenge we have is that the workforce system has not been a part of that organism to date, and we need to get it to be a part of the organism. And to be a part of it, you have to add value. Otherwise, you're not even going to be at the table.
Yeah, Bob?
You know, it's hard to remember this, but 3 or 4 years ago, there were books written like, what was it called, 2010, Age of Crisis in Workforce. We were all going to walk off the cliff because of retirements and skill shortages. This wasn't that long ago, and suddenly it's not that those aren't going to happen. They've just been put off for about 10 years. So you can go through industry after industry, manufacturing, healthcare, construction, many others. Those retirements will be there, and we can actually do some real planning around those key sectors that you find in many cities. Now, along the way, you have to pay attention to medical records and healthcare reform and changes in global transportation, but we can do some planning, and we can have some certainty around what those job areas will be and what are the common set of skill levels that are going to be required to be successful in them.
You want to jump in?
Just real quickly, the Chicago Workforce Investment Council that just spoke does projections, and I was just looking at those, coming into here today. To your question, one of the interesting things, they do more work than a lot of local organizations do. And yet, in terms of where they are, based on the tools we have, the kind of data we can gather, what we can try to do to look ahead in some kind of crystal ball, they've got probably what will turn out to be somewhat accurate projections for 10 years out on the kinds of occupations that may occur, and to an extent what industries those occupations might be connected to. But what we don't know is the answer to your question at all, and it's this whole proximity thing. Are they going to keep growing out there at the outer collar of the 7 metro area? Are some of them coming back downtown? How many will even care where their workers are? Because the workers will be where the workers are, and headquarters will be a place that houses servers and other things, not necessarily the place where people come to anymore. And so there's lots of those kind of things that, no matter how many times we overlay data and then sort of drop it on a map and do, geo-mapping of it, we're still left at the end of the day with a bunch of numbers that we probably don't quite know what to do with. And I think it's an intriguing question. And as soon as we crack that one, a lot of this neighborhood planning will be a lot easier.
Houston.
Great, thanks for coming back to us. The three questions we have, the first one is from a leader in our faith community and a CDC executive director as well. He'd like to know if anyone's successfully working with churches to get jobs into communities and people into jobs, and if not, why not? And if so, where is it happening well? So the next question is from an economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. Given the importance of social networks, how can development efforts expand the networks of minorities and people facing the most employment barriers in enclaves most effectively? And our third question, also from the economist, is what barriers to firm location choice would generate the spatial skill mismatch, and what policies would you advocate to alleviate the effects of those barriers?
Great.
Thanks.
Terrific questions. One, I'm going to give you the first two. The question on churches and jobs and that relationship, and also social networks and how do we use those to benefit people who are isolated and to expand their own networks.
Yeah, I think when you take an asset-based approach, getting one church member into your program and they're being successful means you got a recruiter for the whole church, right? And so there's a real built-in incentive to anyone, and when it comes to doing employment work and workforce work, is really a lot about how much of the market can you reach, because you need to have the flow in order to serve the business that you're looking to serve. So I think that's been our experience. And just on the social networks, the only thing I'll say is that programs have to be built in order to do that. When we just launched a charter school that takes ninth graders who want to become doctors and pairs them up with two, not one, but two Rush University college, medical college students to mentor them from ninth grade all the way to 12th grade, so that in fact, their dream of becoming a pediatrician or medical doctor can actually come through. That's a social network. They're friends that they can totally access. We have to build that into what we do in high schools, in grammar schools, and in workforce programs.
Mark, you wanted to
I just want to jump
comment.
in with actually an example from Texas. The Industrial Areas Foundation there, it has its roots here in Chicago. I hope people know the history of that. The Texas branch is organized through churches, and they've created a network of job training organizations that I regard as among the most effective in the country. San Antonio has Project Quest. Austin has Capital Idea. They have projects down in the valley. These are all the result of community organizing through churches, in which they will bring statewide 10,000 people to a Coliseum in Austin and put the gubernatorial candidates on record as whether they support workforce development or not. And they then deliver those resources in flexible community development or general tax levy resources, not just WIA money, which, as we all know, is pretty inflexible, to nonprofit training organizations. And as part of they not only create these, they remain on the board and they're principal recruiters for the organization. So when you want to go into Project Quest, you've got to meet with two of the church members as part of your interview process. And they say, we're going to hold you accountable for succeeding in this program. So, know that it's not just the nonprofit that's there. So it's not only the churches being involved, it's the social network. They're saying, we invested our sweat and blood to create this opportunity for you. We're very happy that you have it, but know that we're counting on you succeeding, and we'll be watching.
Bob, you have a comment?
Just a story. We work a lot with Johns Hopkins Health System in Baltimore. And one time we went to the head of their HR and said, well, who are your top suppliers of people for entry-level work? And interestingly enough, workforce development or employment was not in the name of any of these groups. They were all groups. They tended to be religious or have some spiritual foundation. They provided a holistic kind of view of what folks needed to move back into the workforce. So certainly on the most vulnerable side of the labor market, this is a especially important role, I think, for religious institutions to play a role. And we've seen that in the reentry arena as well.
The third question from Houston was this question of barriers to firm location and how to address those. Byron, you have a thought about? a response to that, or others on the panel? I don't want to put you on the spot.
Yeah, you know, and I don't know that I have an answer for that specifically, but probably it's a good place just to talk about this idea of barriers about limited flexibility in WI investments and how do they match up with other investments, and so how do you get a community strategy. Just wanted to say that, you know, we do hear that loud and clear. WIA reauthorization may actually happen sometime, and when it does, I think that what we're looking at is moving in the direction of talking about much more unified community-based planning that we've all talked about today, that we are talking about trying to, whether we're talking about a HUD housing program, a WIA invested dislocated worker strategy, or a USDA approach to healthy food, that we're trying to all figure out how to get much more aligned on allowing communities to have common sets of goals and visions, and then allowing our investments to move in that direction as long as we get certain kinds of performance indicators, but moving in that direction. So I think in terms of this overall topic, that's helpful. In terms of the specifics of locating companies, I don't think that's my expertise.
Bob?
You know, I was just going to say that and Mark kind of hinted at this, if companies locate and build on the periphery, they're taking advantage or assuming there's infrastructure, there's openness to support them, and then they end up with labor shortages out there. I think part of this Sustainable Communities Broad HUD planning process has to ask the question of costs and benefits of allowing that kind of development to keep occurring. Because the more it occurs, the more we have this kind of spread and disconnection. And there's real costs and benefits to the competitive location of firms versus the expenditure of public dollars, which is significant.
Right. And if you were to address that from a policy standpoint, Bob, at the federal level, what changes would you make?
Well, it's where highway funding goes versus where transit-oriented development goes. It gets to you know, lots of housing credit. I mean, there's lots of issues, environmental planning.
As long as zoning and taxes are controlled, locally, federal policymakers can spend all the time they want trying to figure out what they can do to try to prevent it, but it's very little they can do to stop the incentives that provide for people building housing, locating firms in areas where they want those.
Well, transportation policy is not an insignificant driver here.
But people have been willing to locate without the roads being built, right? They're going and locating there before the roads are constructed. The roads and schools are catching up, but they're willing to go and make that bet because that's the way it tends to work. The only hope I see long-term for this is actually the environmental movement. If they actually say the green spaces on the periphery are so important to the health of this region that those need to be preserved and we've got to contain growth within those boundaries, I don't think it's going to be possible to really stop this continued sprawl. Certainly no city has succeeded in it so far.
Minneapolis had another question or comment.
5 quick questions in Minneapolis, and we can hold for a response until all questions are asked.
So,
hello, I'm Francisco Segovia. I'm from Pillsbury United Communities, and I do have a question. It's going to be a little bit different. At the Way House Community Center, we have a food shelf, and often we see a lot of people coming to use the food shelf who are already employed but are working in industries where they make $7.50 or $8 per hour. So what would you suggest for us encouraging the industry sector like stores or supermarkets and so on, who often offer part-time jobs, no benefits, $7.50 an hour? We have a lot of people working in those industries, and they don't seem to understand that those the $7.50 an hour jobs just generate poverty as well.
You know, your point, too, can be put in a larger context. I think if you look at the top 10 fastest growing jobs in America, projected fastest growing jobs, I think 6 of them don't pay a living wage. Byron, I'm sure, though, you have the answer to this.
Absolutely. Oh, this is, you know, there's been lots written about this, the shrinking middle class, all those kind of things, and this is just one of those phenomena. And And we talked earlier about the mismatch, the project. Why don't employers hire certain people? Why do they hire who they hire, et cetera? And in some ways, there's so many layers in this onion. I don't know how to start answering, especially when we talk about the supply of food. So first of all, major fresh food suppliers don't even want to locate in a lot of the neighborhoods we're talking about. To the extent they start to move in and locate there, their model is based on the fact that they're surrounded by workers who will work for less because they have a lower expectation, and for that community, it's still a pretty good wage. May not be a living wage, but it's better than the other wages that aren't even there for the most part. So this is a layer upon layer kind of thing, and I do not know the answer. I mean, as long as the economic model of food distribution and other sorts of retail places like that rely on the lowest wage possible, and while there's a labor supply that will walk in the door and do that, from a purely market standpoint, I frankly don't know how you deal with that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's a whole argument out there that lots of folks in Chicago certainly know that you've got to create better jobs out of this, and whether it's bargaining with new companies to pay living or family supporting wages, fighting for things like paid sick leave. There's a whole variety, a whole suite of benefits that need to be part of those firms, and that'll only still get you part of the way. I think more broadly, there's a kind of social contract discussion in the United States as a whole about if we're going to keep producing these kind of low-wage jobs, what's the safety net for that? How do you expect people to stay in them? How do you expect them to do well by their families and kids? Certainly healthcare is a part of that, but there's many other pieces. So it's something that gets addressed locally, and you can see that across the metros across the country, but it's a bigger issue as well.
It is related to the earlier question about are there enough jobs? Mm-hmm. And once upon a time in a community, working at the grocery store might have been considered that part-time job where it was supplementing something else in the family, and so it was really okay because it made up a household income, or it was a young person's job kind of on the way up and out. And so, at one point that was really kind of okay. Yeah. And now lots of other jobs have disappeared, and we've got would-be full-time breadwinners now going to that job and just hanging on because it's the only thing there. And so lots of things have changed in the economic model about what makes up this community that the store is in, that these people are working in. And until we get back to some concept of either figuring out what is full employment in the 21st century, and if full employment is not at a level, well, if it is at a level that leaves a significant number of people not engaged there, then what's the economic solution? How do we want to address that?
Right. And there may even be a different question related to that, and it's what is work, right? I mean, what is work, and redefining work, which I think is even more of a challenge, but a discussion we're not even having, really. Juan, you wanted to comment on this, and then we're going to go to San Francisco.
I just wanted to say that there's a reason why Henry Ford decided to pay his workers more, so they can afford to buy his cars. And I think there has to be a conversation among, in boardrooms and among shareholders and among corporate CEOs about how do you, create an economy that we can all benefit from.
Do you think that conversation's taking place?
I think people are going to force that conversation. You cannot have a country continue to move in this direction without that conversation being had. And I think there are organizations like ours who live in communities who are trying to move people up pathways will be helping to spur that kind of conversation on. Mm-hmm. We cannot survive this way.
All right, we have one more comment or question from San Francisco. Oh, and one from Boston. Okay, we'll take those two and then we'll wrap.
Hi, my name is Jaime Aguilar, Program Director for River Hospital Silicon Valley in San Jose, California.
We'll say.
Is there a question here? Can you hear him okay?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay, so we see the difficulties of people just getting through the crisis on keeping their houses. Is shrinking, like we just said, and kind of going to piggyback a little bit on the question before. But how's the labor force adapting to the 80% distribution of wealth that is shrinking the middle class in the United States? And that's directly reflected by the fact that people lose one job in the household, they cannot keep their home, and they have to move into rental.
Bob?
I didn't quite understand.
I didn't hear you.
You know what? Would you repeat the question in San Francisco? Sorry, but we're not sure we heard all of it. The shrinking middle class and housing, but we're not sure what the question was.
Okay. How's the labor force adapting to the 80%, 20% distribution of wealth that is shrinking the middle class in the United States? And that here in San Jose, we feel it because the people that we serve in our organization are losing their homes because either one person in the household loses their job.
So people are, because people have been relying on two incomes in a family, one loses their job, housing goes into foreclosure, people are losing their homes.
Yeah, the only thing I can say about that is I think we have to think about lots of other life skills that are required in order to be successful. And since we're talking about mobility, I just put down that being able to deal with situations that occur in families is something that we need to be better about showing people how to do. And mobility itself is something that is a competitive advantage. If you're able to uproot yourself from one place to another, you're going to be a more marketable asset in this economy. And so we actually have to have those conversations with folks. And so it's not about neighborhoods as much anymore as it is about families being able to adjust. I think those people that can adjust quicker are going to have a better life.
Mm-hmm. Does that say something about housing policy?
Well, we still haven't come up with scale-level solutions to foreclosure issues, and it's still working its way through most communities. So that's a big issue, and employment instability just accelerates that. Right. And that's a whole conversation in itself. I do think, and it's something Byron mentioned, we're going to have to rethink home ownership, not simply as a housing option, but an asset-building tool, and how we work on that for the future. I think that's a big issue, and I don't think we've begun talking about that in some quarters, but it really needs attention.
And it's something that, in this market, constrains mobility.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Okay, one last question from Boston.
Okay. Hi, I'm Jeff Stone with the Communities Resilient Families program called Mattapan United in one of Boston's neighborhoods. Here in New England, we traditionally have not been great fans of regional collaboration. We like to do it on our own in our municipalities. So my question is, have the panelists seen differences around the country in terms of willingness to entertain regional, metropolitan planning and implementation with regard to things that we've talked about, like locating employment opportunities, residential concentrations, transportation, and educational resources?
Yeah, terrific question. Byron, have you seen good examples of regional decision-making cooperation?
You know, I don't know of the model that works in that sense, but there are a number of places where they're making important strides forward. I think we're sitting in one of those places, Chicago and the 7-county metro area, on the whole community college front, the workforce investment front, which, you know, I talk about not not because it's the whole world, but it's the pieces I pay the most attention to, have certainly been working together for some time, and they've put together a number of interesting sort of connections. We talked about not all community colleges can or should be experts in everything, and starting to figure out when are, looking at them, when are they competitors and when are they collaborators in trying to, grow out various sectors of the industry, and who'll train for what, and they can't all do it all. That in partnership with a workforce system that sees itself as having these broad regional interests, but needing to look at like where an actual employer is, where employees are, and how to make those connections. So trying to look at both the macro and the micro, and I think that Seven County group has done pretty well. Denver has worked on it for some time, probably not quite where Chicago is yet. To take a place that really knows it needs to do it right now, Detroit. Detroit is at a place where the surrounding county has essentially recognized that the condition Detroit is in is not a place that will allow sustained growth in the county around it. That if we want to hang on to what we perceive we still have, by contrast to the downtown Detroit area, then we need to invest in downtown Detroit. So I think there's a realization of it. I think there are activities going on. I mean, I don't know. If the group if there's a group that's made it and they've got it figured out, I haven't read their report yet, but there's lots of things going on.
Do you think do you think regional cooperation is easier where there is one clearly dominant city in the region? And plus in Chicago, there's been a dominant political leader in the region with tenure.
Oh, now you want me to comment on that?
Well, I'm just asking, what are there hallmarks of things that regional cooperation that look like their characteristics?
One of the remote sites has a live microphone on that needs to be muted.
Thanks, Jerry. Yeah, we're hearing that.
I think that I think that probably I think that having one dominant partner is not necessarily the long-term sustaining model. I think what is important is whether you have big and small, dominant and not dominant, is that every partner brings something to the table and it's valued and there's equal return on investment coming back out of it, so that you can have a very strong mayor in a huge city like Chicago, and you can have less urban areas, but there has to be a partnership. I mean, right now the city and Cook County are talking about economic, community, and workforce development and what's the future of their business and should it be integrated or not. And there's some really interesting numbers you can look at where the county has more people by far than the city, but the city spends a lot more money than the county. And how are all those investments going to come together, and who will start to worry about, are we still getting our fair share if we all do this cooperatively and collaboratively? So there's lots of questions that have to be asked and answered. I don't think any of them are easy. I think that probably the thing I would say, I've talked about community boards. I'm a great believer in community and grassroots board and putting things together. But here's what we always end up assuming, I think, whether we're a community-based nonprofit or whether we're the feds putting money out with guidance saying, yeah, pull together community partners, do good planning, and we'll fund you, is that process is actually a known science. And that when we have, workforce professionals who devote their life to this, when we have community volunteers who show up, say, once a month at a planning table, that when they get in that room together, they're really well versed on what it is to do regional planning and neighborhood implementation and do these things. I mean, we have lots of committed, smart people, but I think that the researchers, publish reports and know some things, acknowledge that they don't know everything and some things work and some don't, and there's a lot of pressure on a group of people getting together, place to place to place across this country saying, in 2 hours once a month, develop this regional collaboration strategy that really works. Talk about what is work. That's work, and we somewhat relegate it to a few hours a month, and the rest of the time we're busy doing implementation.
Right. Well, the world's shortest lunch break has just become 2 minutes shorter. You now have 13 minutes to get lunch and bring it back inside. But before you go, please help me thank our panel.